Hello, my name is Adi Benito. I'm an endocrinologist in private practice in Princeton, New Jersey. I practice integrative endocrinology, which is a combination of the best of Western medicine with the best of any other discipline, including mind-body, nutrition, herbals, and supplements. I'm also part of the SAPPERS programs. I'm on the board of trustees. And this is a lecture on diabetes, preserving function at any stage, improving the odds of success. Next. I was struck by this piece. It's an opinion piece in the New York Times in October 2016, written by a woman with diabetes. And she spoke about the burden of the disease, about the burden of constantly checking numbers and keeping those numbers within a particular range. And that's important because as clinicians and patients, we sometimes get focused and very narrow on just looking at the numbers. Next. There's a recent study that questions that practice of just trying to look at the numbers only, when in fact diabetes is much larger than just keeping numbers within a range. Next. So to understand how to preserve function, how to improve the odds of success, we need to understand the core defect in diabetes. And there are two main core defects. One is a beta cell dysfunction. And that means that your beta cells, the cells in the pancreas that make insulin, do not work perfectly fine. They are a bit dysfunctional. They don't make as much insulin as they should. The second defect is what we call insulin resistance. And that means that your cells cannot use that insulin properly. So you have two defects. One, not making enough insulin. Two, not using the insulin properly. So the end result is that the sugar, which the insulin brings into the cells, stays out of the cells and brings your sugar levels up. But beyond that, there are two other defects. One is what we call glucose toxicity. And that means that sugar by itself is toxic to your pancreas. It creates more beta cell dysfunction. It creates more insulin resistance. And at the core of all that is inflammation. So if we target inflammation, we can improve all that milieu of defects of type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance has many different factors that cause it. We know genetics play a role, but obesity, in particular, the fat distribution on the middle part of our body is important. And then aging and some dietary nutrients are important for insulin resistance. Next. This is a bit of more of a complicated slide, just not to make things as simple as I made in the previous slide, to tell you that the defects in diabetes are global. They're all through your body. They are in the fat cells, in the gut, in the liver, the pancreas, the brain, and the muscle, and the kidneys. Next. But at the bottom, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is at that balance, the balance between insulin resistance and beta cell function. So, if you have a very low beta cell function because of your genetics or whatever else, you need to lower your insulin resistance in order to keep that balance. Next. That's important because when somebody's diagnosed with diabetes, which is this point here, at that point, somebody has lost already about 50% of their beta cells, that pancreatic function. So somebody is here. This is normal. Somebody with diabetes is down at that point. And if you get diagnosed with diabetes, not just when you develop it, but years later, because you're not caught early, you could have even a 15% of function only. So remember, the lower your beta cell function, the lower you have to keep that insulin resistance in order to keep your sugars at a reasonable range. Next. So there's a recent study that has brought up the thought of this very low calorie diet. And this is something that was done as a research study, not something that I say you do at home. But it just gives us some ideas of what we can do in order to reverse diabetes. These patients were subjected to a very low calorie diet and they went back on a lower calorie but more normal, and they were able to reverse diabetes. Can you go to the next page, the next slide? So what we can learn from this study is that the one who responded to the treatment, the ones who reversed the diabetes, they were younger, they had diabetes for fewer years, they were taking fewer medications, and they had lower fasting glucose and lower hemoglobin A1C and higher insulin levels. What that tells me is that they were earlier in the disease progression. So the earlier you catch it, the better you will do. So it's motivation to do something when you're diagnosed. Now, it's important also to note that some of the people who went to remission had diabetes for more than 8 years. So it doesn't mean that if you've had diabetes for a long time, you cannot reverse it. You still could, but it's easier if you're early in the disease. Next. So if we look at why this worked, what happened, we think that it's perhaps how your body stores fat. And that has to do with the liver and the pancreas. So when you put fat around your liver, that goes into the pancreas, and it doesn't allow the pancreas to work well. It doesn't allow you to make insulin as well. So if you go on a very low-calorie diet, you start to use the fat from the liver so that it decreases the fat around the pancreas, and it wakes up that capacity of the pancreas to make insulin. So you improve that beta cell function. Next. So we've talked about that balance of insulin and beta cell function. And I want to work a little bit on talking about inflammation and how that's important and how we can work with inflammation. So I want to introduce the concept of dietary AGEs. AGEs stands for Advanced Glycosylation End Product. And those are chemicals that make your body inflamed. They increase inflammation. If you have low AGEs in your diet, you will improve inflammation, especially in diabetes. Where do you get those AGEs? How do they come into your world? Well, processed foods are high in AGEs. And that's because AGEs, these advanced glycosylation end products, are formed whenever you dry heat something. And most of your ready-to-eat foods, your breakfast cereals, your cookies, your snacks, they're all produced by this high-temperature dry heating process. You can also produce AGEs when you're cooking at home, mostly if you cook protein at high temperatures. So a way for you to control those AGEs when you're cooking at home is to use moist heat, shorter cooking times, cooking with lower temperatures, and then use acidic ingredients like vinegar or lemon. Next. So this is a diagram that reviews what dietary polyphenols, these chemicals that are in plants, naturally in plants, mostly they're chemicals that give the plants that red and deep blue colors. So your red peppers and the blueberries and your eggplants, all those because they have polyphenols. So polyphenols are anti-inflammatory chemicals. So they're the good chemicals, the ones you want in your body. This is a study that looked at what these polyphenols can do in your body and where they can work to work on glucose and the metabolism of sugar. So they work in your gut, in the muscle, in the fat cells, in the pancreas, in the liver, pretty much at every single stage, every single organ or organ system in your body that can metabolize glucose. And the benefits are incredible. Next. These are all the polyphenols that we know of, all these good chemicals that you want in your body. So there are phenolic acid, flavonoids, stilbenes, lignans. Within the flavonoids, there are all those categories. So just look at the foods that have them. You should be trying to incorporate as many of those as you can in your diet. And I'm not talking to just have coffee and chocolate and tea. That's okay. Or wine. You want to include your curly kale. You want to put some parsley and leek and tomatoes and broccoli and berries and legumes, asparagus, depending on how they work in your system. But you should try to aim to incorporate those in your diet. Next. Of the polyphenols, the group that has been the most studied is the flavonoids. There's a study showing that the higher your flavonoid intake, the lower the insulin resistance and the lower the inflammation. With the types of flavonoids, flavones and anthocyanins have been looked at. And those are in those foods that you see there: oranges, peppers, wine, parsley, apples, red, purple, blue color, so your berries, red peppers, red cabbage, grapes. So what is interesting is that just one portion of those high flavonoid foods can lower your blood pressure and your blood glucose. One portion. So imagine if you had more than just one during the day. Next. There are other foods that are also helpful in diabetes in trying to preserve that function. And one of them is magnesium-rich foods. So magnesium-rich foods work because magnesium lowers your insulin resistance and also improves inflammation. When you have insulin resistance, there tends to be a low magnesium level in the body. So you want to include foods like green leafy vegetables, spinach, kale, or chard. You want to include nuts like almonds, seeds, also legumes. All those are magnesium rich. Next. Now, beyond food, there are other things we can do to improve the body's ability to either produce insulin or reduce that insulin resistance. And one of them is exercise. Exercise does both. So exercise will promote that preservation of the beta cells. You keep them longer, healthier, but it also decreases the inflammatory cytokines in the body. So it works at the inflammation. Exercises such as resistance training, Tai Chi, Qigong have been looked at, and all of them will do those things for those with diabetes. Next. We cannot forget about sleep. When people have looked at lack of sleep, they found that lack of sleep increases your insulin resistance, and lack of sleep also decreases beta cell function. So remember that balance we showed in the beginning? So you're lowering both. You're lowering the beta cell, you're lowering the insulin resistance, you're increasing insulin resistance. So you're going the wrong direction. You're not trying to get, you're really off if you don't sleep. Even one night without sleep has been shown to increase that insulin resistance in healthy people. It seems that it's worse for men than it is for women, but I'm gonna say make sure you sleep. 6 to 9 hours, depends on who you are. You might be okay with 6, you might be okay with 9. Less than 6 and more than 9 is gonna worsen insulin resistance and beta cell function. Next. And I couldn't finish without mentioning some chemicals that you should try to avoid because of their potential link with diabetes. One of them is fluoride, supplemental fluoride. And the data is still very preliminary, but it seems as if fluoride is definitely a precursor or induces diabetes. There are other chemicals that we call obesogens, and that's because they create obesity in the body by different mechanisms. Those are DDT, which we might have been exposed to. PFOAs, those are the chemicals that coat the non-stick pans, so don't use those. And then emulsifiers, and I put those with a question mark because the data from emulsifiers comes from animals. There's no human data. My concern is that if emulsifiers can induce a state of pre-diabetes in animals, I think it could do the same thing in humans. It's a concern. Those emulsifiers are what keeps your sauces and your ice creams fluffy, if you wish. And there are two that were looked in a study, carboxymethyl cellulose and polysorbate 80. So if you see those listed, don't buy that. And I also want to mention again your ages, those advanced glycosylation end products in processed foods, and then high temperature, the frying, the broiling of animal protein. Next. So I want to end by returning to this slide where we saw all these defects that diabetes entails and how different strategies can work on those defects, how polyphenols have so many different actions in the body that you really should try to incorporate those in your diet every day. We talk about sleep, how it works on insulin, how it works on the pancreas. We talk about exercise. And then there are other things like omega-3s, which also affect the fat. And you definitely want to increase your omega-3 consumption in the diet. And for the liver, you also want to work on the polyphenols as well as decreasing fructose in your diet. Next. So I want to go back to that initial slide of that burden, that person who was trying to be perfect with her numbers. And I want to end with this quote by a friend of mine who just wrote a book called Silent Leaders. And she says, "Perfection is black and white. We are either perfect or not, and calls forth judgment. But excellence evokes a work in progress, inviting us to continually strive toward our best while learning from the process as it unfolds. When we work toward excellence, we discover that miscalculation and mistakes serve as portals for growth and refinement, sometimes leading to something entirely new." And with that, I want to leave you. And I hope that this was beneficial to you and that you will take some of the recommendations and that you will improve those odds of success and preserve the function of your pancreas and your beta cells. Thank you.